Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental. It's about how we actually know who has access to drinking water, especially, in places where water isn't just piped into your home.
Right. It seems like it should be simple. Just ask, right? But figuring out who has reliable access, that's actually way more complex than it sounds.
Exactly. And we're grounding this deep dive in some specific research, a case study out of Malawi. It really digs into the methods we use to measure water access and, maybe more importantly, how reliable those methods actually are.
Yeah, it takes a look under the hood, so to speak, at the data collection that all those big global targets rely on.
So our mission here is to unpack what this study found. We want to give you a clearer sense of the real challenges in tracking who has safely managed drinking water and why getting the measurement right is so critical for global goals and, honestly, some of the surprising inconsistencies the researchers found when they compared different ways of measuring.
And I'll be here to help connect those findings to the bigger picture, what it all means for monitoring efforts around the world.
Great. So let's start with the global context. Water access, it's been a big deal in development goals for a long time. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, they had a target.
They did, focused on basically improved water sources, but that term improved, well, it turned out to be a bit limited.
Let's look at how.
It often painted too rosy a picture. It didn't fully capture whether the access was truly reliable or safe day in, day out. It missed a lot.
Okay, so that brings us to the current goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And SDG 6.1 is the big one for water.
Much more ambitious. It calls for universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all by 2030. That's a high bar.
And to track that, the official body, the UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program, the JMP, they shifted how they measure things.
Right. They moved away from just improved source to something called safely managed drinking water services.
Safely managed? Okay, what does that actually mean on the ground?
It's got several layers. It's not just an improved source, like a protected well. It also has to be on the premises, available when people need it, and crucially free from contamination, both microbial and chemical.
So location, availability, and quality. That's a lot more demanding.
Exactly. And the reason for that change was precisely because the old way missed key things, like how far do people have to walk? Is the pump actually working today? How much water can they realistically carry? And is the water actually safe to drink when they drink it?
Which, you can imagine, makes monitoring way harder, especially for the, billions who don't have taps at home. Collecting data on all those factors, availability, quality, access consistently and affordably. That seems like a massive undertaking.
It really is. And that's why, in practice, a lot of the global estimates still lean heavily on standard national household surveys, the MICS, DHS, LSMS surveys.
And those surveys often rely on asking people questions, right? Self-reporting.
Yeah, exactly. Asking things like, what kind of source do you mainly use? Or how long does it usually take to go get water and come back?
Which lands us right on the core question this Malawi study tackles. How good are those self-reported answers? How valid, how reliable are they when you actually compare them to objective, measured data?
And what else could we do? Are there better ways to get a more accurate picture for these global estimates? If you care about knowing what's really going on with development goals, this is fundamentally important.
Okay, let's zoom in on this study then. Yeah. Where and when did this happen?
So this was in southern Malawi. They looked at households in a couple of peri-urban areas, in Durande and Mbayani, and one rural area, Chikwawa. And the data collection was done back in April 2019, so towards the end of the rainy season there.
And who were they talking to?
They specifically focused on 375 households that didn't have water on their property. That's the key group where measuring things like travel time and water quality at home becomes really critical and complex.
And how did they compare the different measurements? What was the method?
It was a cross-sectional study, so a snapshot in time. They basically compared what people said in a detailed questionnaire similar to what's in MICS surveys with what trained enumerators observed and measured directly.
Observed and measured. Like what?
Things like using GPS devices to map the location of the home and the water source, actually timing the walk, observing the type of water source and storage containers, and doing on-the-spot water quality tests.
Okay, so really direct comparisons. Did they think these methods could actually be used more widely?
That was a key part of it, yeah. They specifically chose methods they felt were, feasible, replicable, reasonably cost-effective. The idea wasn't just academic curiosity. It was about testing practical improvements for large-scale monitoring, even where resources are tight.
So testing potential upgrades to the standard survey toolkit.
You got it. They looked at four main things, comparing the self-reported version versus the objective or measured version, the water sources people used, the quantity of water they collected, the quality and accessibility, basically, time and distance.
All right, let's unpack the findings. Starting with water sources. Did people generally report the right type of source?
For the most part, yes. On source type, self-reporting seemed pretty valid. About 87% of households named a source type like a borehole or public tap that matched what the enumerator saw and even photographed.
What about the other 13–14%? Where did the mismatch come from?
Often it was about local names versus official categories. Is it a public tap or a water kiosk? Sometimes about perceived ownership. People might see a communal tap as theirs or private in some sense. So even simple classification isn't always perfect with self-reports.
Interesting. Did they look at cost? Paying for water?
They did ask about it and found quite a few. 38% reported paying. This was really common in the peri-urban areas. Nearly everyone using kiosks or taps, they're paid. It underlines that affordability is a key dimension of access, even though this study wasn't set up to objectively measure how affordable it was. Other studies really focus on that.
Okay, but here's something you mentioned earlier that sounded really important: functionality.
Ah, yes. This was a big one, a really significant finding. Even though households reported using a specific source and often said it was available year-round, for nearly a third of them, 32%, that primary source was not actually working when the enumerator visited.
Wait, 32%? A third of the main water sources were broken on the day.
Broken or just not delivering water, yeah, that's huge. It tells you that just asking what source do you use or is it usually available can completely miss the reality of intermittent supply or frequent breakdowns.
So we need ways to check if the tap is actually running, not just if it exists.
Precisely. You need to capture functionality at the time of need.
Okay, wow. That definitely complicates the picture. What about water quantity? How much water did people say they were collecting?
Well, the average reported daily collection was somewhere between 42 and 75 liters per person, depending on how you calculated it from their answers, which seemed maybe a bit higher than some other studies in the region, but there wasn't a direct national comparison figure for Malawi.
But you said there was an inconsistency issue here.
A major one, yeah. This was striking. They asked people directly, how much water does your household collect in a typical day? And they got an average answer of about 186 liters per household.
Okay.
But then they also asked about the number of trips made per day and the amount carried per trip, and they calculated a daily total from that. And that calculation yielded an average of 333 liters per household per day.
Whoa, that's almost double. How can the same people give answers that lead to such different totals?
It really suggests significant issues with recall or estimation. Maybe people aren't great at estimating total daily use directly. Or maybe they exaggerate, perhaps unintentionally, how many trips they make or how much they carry each time. Things like reporting, fetching 100 times a day or carrying 80 containers per trip. Clearly errors.
Right, those sound like data entry errors or just wild guesses.
Exactly. So that calculation method based on trips and volume per trip seems prone to serious overestimation based on this study. It really highlights how hard it is to get solid quantity data just by asking.
Did they look at what people store water in, the containers?
Yeah, they did. And mostly, what people said they used matched what the enumerators saw, about 86% agreement on the type of container.
Mostly, but not always.
Right. There was a hint of what we call social desirability bias. About 7% of households said they used a covered storage container, which is seen as more hygienic, but the enumerator actually observed them using an uncovered one.
Ah, saying what they think sounds better or safer.
Kind of, yeah. A small percentage, but it shows that bias can creep in. So overall, for quantity, without actually measuring the water flow or volume directly, which is hard to do at scale, validating self-reports is really, really tricky.
Okay, so sources have functionality issues, quantity has reliability issues. Let's talk quality. This feels like the most critical for health.
Absolutely. And the findings here are, I think, among the most important. The headline result is that the microbial quality of the water tested right at the source was often significantly different from the quality of the water tested in the cup at the household the water people were actually about to drink.
Different how? Better or worse?
Generally worse. In 2/3 of the cases, 67%, the water quality deteriorated from the source to the cup. It picked up more contamination along the way.
So recontamination during transport and storage is a major issue. That matches other research, doesn't it?
It does, sadly. It's a well-documented problem. But here's the really fascinating part. How did people's perception of the water quality line up with these measurements?
Okay, what did they find?
Well, people's perception of whether their water was safe did correlate significantly with the measured quality at the source. If the source water tested clean, they tended to think their water was clean.
That makes some sense. You base your judgment on where it comes from?
Exactly. But, and this is the crucial disconnect, their perception was not significantly linked to the measured quality in the cup. They weren't sensing or perhaps acknowledging the contamination happening between the source and their home.
So they think it's safe because the source is okay, but they're actually drinking riskier water.
In many cases, yes. The study found that almost two-thirds of households, 64%, overestimated the safety of the water they were about to drink in the cup.
Wow. That is a huge potential health risk, that false sense of security.
It absolutely is, and it helps explain another finding. Very few households, only 9%, reported treating their water at home.
And why not?
The main reason given by 85% of those who didn't treat was that they believed the water was already clean. Another 13% mentioned cost.
And let me guess, saying it was already clean was linked to their perception, not the actual measured quality.
Precisely. Reporting the water was already clean correlated strongly with their perception of its quality, but not with the actual microbial test results, either at the cup or even at the source.
Okay, that's a critical insight for health interventions, isn't it? People think source to safety and they miss the risks of handling and storage.
Completely. It really drives home the need to promote safe water handling, safe storage, and point-of-use treatment, like boiling or filters. Even if the source itself seems clean or is perceived as clean, the journey home matters a lot.
Okay, so we've covered sources, quantity, and quality. What about the fourth piece? Accessibility. The time and distance involved in fetching water.
Right. So looking at the averages across the different ways they measured it, most households in this particular study sample seem to have relatively good access in terms of distance. The average one-way trip was generally under 10 minutes or 200 meters.
So not extreme distances for this group.
Not on average, no. But the key finding here wasn't the average itself, but the significant differences and inconsistencies they found between the various methods used to measure that time and distance.
Ah, so comparing self-report against objective measures again, which method came out looking the most reliable?
The most reliable based on its correlations with other objective measures was Euclidean distance.
Euclidean distance, remind me.
That's the straight line distance, as the crow flies, calculated using the GPS coordinates they took at the household and at the water source.
Got it. So that simple GPS measurement worked best.
It showed the strongest, most consistent relationship with things like the distance the enumerator estimated by observation on the ground, and also with the actual walking time recorded using a timer on the GPS device.
Okay, so what was the least reliable measure then?
That would be the self-reported collection time. Just asking people, how long does it take you? That showed only a weak correlation with the objective measures, like the GPS distance or the timed walk.
And were people generally accurate, or did they tend to over or underestimate?
They tended to overestimate the time compared to the objective measurements. Their memory or perception of the time involved wasn't very accurate.
What about waiting time? Queuing at the source can take ages. Did they factor that in?
They asked about it, but they found self-reported queue time was, in their words, an ambiguous measure. People seem to really struggle to separate walking time from waiting time in their heads when reporting a total trip time.
How so?
Well, sometimes people even reported a queue time that was longer than the entire round-trip time they reported. It just didn't add up. It suggests that asking for a single total collection time figure that includes queuing is probably quite unreliable if you're relying on self-report.
So maybe you need to ask about travel time and queue time separately.
That's what the study suggests, yes. Trying to get separate estimates for one-way travel time, which GPS could help with, and average queue time might give better data, although measuring queue time accurately is still a challenge.
This brings up a practical point, though. If self-reported time is unreliable, are these objective methods like GPS actually practical for the big national surveys?
That's one of the really hopeful findings here. The researchers argue, yes, it's increasingly feasible. Many large-scale surveys already use tablets or smartphones with GPS capabilities for sampling or location mapping.
So the technology is often already there.
Pretty much. Integrating the recording of GPS coordinates for homes and sources, or even using the device's timer function to record walk times during the survey visit, could potentially be added without massive extra cost or complexity. And it could provide much more reliable data on accessibility than just asking people to estimate the time.
Okay, let's try and pull all these threads together then. We've gone through sources, quantity, quality, accessibility. What's the big picture takeaway here? Why does getting these measurements right or wrong actually matter to you, the listener, or to achieving those global goals?
Well, it matters hugely because the study strongly suggests that the common practice of relying heavily on self-reported data, especially for things like water quantity and collection time, gives you potentially shaky, inconsistent information. It's just not as reliable as more objective measures.
And the quality perception issue.
And the quality finding is critical. People judging safety based on the source alone and not realizing the water gets contaminated after collection. That's a major blind spot that self-reported perception doesn't capture accurately at the point of use.
So if the global numbers, the ones that tell us how close we are to FDG 6.1, are based on these potentially flawed or unreliable self-reported metrics,
Then those global estimates themselves might be inaccurate. We might be overestimating how many people truly have safely managed water, or we might be misunderstanding where the biggest problems really lie, like maybe focusing only on source improvement when post-collection contamination is rampant.
and if the data is wrong, the solutions might be wrong too.
Exactly. Inaccurate data leads to potentially ineffective targeting of resources and interventions. You might build new water points that don't get maintained or miss the need for hygiene promotion about safe storage. It slows down real
The
progress.
stakes are definitely high. It's about health, reducing the daily burden of water collection, especially for women and girls,
Yeah.
and ensuring equity.
Absolutely. Getting the measurement right, using more standardized, more objective methods where feasible, is fundamental to accurately tracking progress, understanding the real challenges, and ultimately ensuring genuinely safe water for everyone.
Of course, we should acknowledge the study's own limits.
For sure. It's one study in specific parts of Malawi. Findings might differ elsewhere. Measuring queue time needs more work. And single water quality tests don't capture fluctuations. It's not the final word.
But the core message seems clear.
I think so. The core message about the limitations of relying solely on self-reporting for some of these critical access dimensions and the potential benefits of incorporating more objective, technology-aided methods is really powerful and important for how we monitor progress globally.
So this deep dive into the Malawi research really highlights the complexity behind that seemingly simple idea of access to drinking water, especially when taps aren't in the home. It really hammers home that how we measure relying on memory versus using GPS, asking about perception versus testing the water in the cup, profoundly shapes our understanding of the reality people face every day.
Yeah, the big takeaway for you listening is that while asking people questions is often the starting point, this study shows objective measures like GPS distance were way more reliable for accessibility. And maybe most importantly, people's perception of water safety based on the source can be dangerously misleading about the quality they actually drink. We need better, more objective, standardized ways to measure if we want to truly track progress towards safe water for all.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. We've talked a lot about measurements, data, indicators. But beyond all that, what does it actually mean? What does it feel like day after day for a family to have genuinely safely managed water, or to constantly struggle for it? What parts of that human experience, the waiting, the physical labor, the anxiety about whether the water is truly safe, the choices you have to make, might even the best objective data fail to fully capture? What does this deep dive into measurement really tell us about the lived reality behind those global statistics?